Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got a video about the U.S. Navy's fleet problems, the training exercises that the U.S. Navy conducted between World War I and World War II. The first fleet problem was conducted in 1923, and the last one was conducted in 1940. There were 21 total, tended to be one each year. And these training exercises gave critical experience to the sailors and officers who would eventually go on to serve during World War II. Perhaps most importantly is these exercises tested new military equipment, such as the brand new aircraft carriers that had just been commissioned after World War I. It gave the Navy experience without having to earn it in wartime. So if this fleet had gone into the war without the tactics and technologies developed during these training exercises, casualties would have been a much higher, and there would have been a much steeper learning curve. These training exercises tended to either take place in the Atlantic or the Pacific, and they often focused around attacking a naval base. Panama, a Caribbean island, or Hawaii were common objectives. And oftentimes, the U.S. fleet would be divided into two forces. Blue, the good guys who were usually defending American assets, and black were the bad guys. These training exercises gave the name to the U.S. Combat fleet during World War II, called the Big Blue Fleet, because this fleet kept switching between 3rd Fleet when Halsey was in charge, 5th Fleet when Spruance was in charge. When you were just talking about the ships without their fleet, they were the Big Blue Fleet, because many of them had been on the blue team during these interwar training exercises. The U.S. Navy during this period tended to be broken up between the battle force, which were the bulk of the battleships, and then their escorting destroyers, cruisers, submarines, whatever else, and the scouting forces, which tended to be some of the older battleships on occasion, sometimes the definitely a lot of the cruisers, some destroyers of their own. But usually they were in inferior force. It was very hard to break the fleet up so that they matched, but also keep them in their expected wartime squadron so they could operate together and get that experience. During these training exercises, there tended to be judges, often assigned to each ship and shore installation, and they would judge during a battle. All right, this ship has taken damage. Show me your damage control in this gun turret area. All right, aircraft have showed up overhead. I'm going to say that there's a 50% chance that they sink this ship, or something like that. And so they are scoring the battle. They are trying to simulate what would happen in battle without actually having two fleets fire at each other. Sometimes they would drop dummy bombs on towed targets, or sometimes they would fire at towed targets. Other times it would just be the two forces engage each other, come into engagement range, and then they go through the rough motions, and these judges would say, all right, this ship sunk, that ship sunk, and go through various scenarios like that. Sometimes you also had ships filling in for other ships. So for example, during Fleet Problem 1, February to March of 1923, off the coast of Canada, the Black Force used some of its battleships to simulate the new aircraft carriers. The United States had aircraft carriers under construction at this time, but not in the service, and they wanted to test the defenses of the Panama Canal. The battleship Oklahoma launched one of its search planes, which was representing an entire squadron, and it dropped miniature bombs on the Panama Canal, and this was ruled to destroy one of the slipways, which would then prevent the American fleet from getting from one side to the other. Surprise attacks on American installations play very heavily into some of these scenarios. January to February of 1924, they held 3 fleet problems, 2, 3, and 4. And these took place in the Caribbean, but they were simulating Pacific islands. These exercises were often testing the American war plans, and the U.S. Navy during this time period had a series of color-coded war plans depending on which country we thought we were going to go to war with. So War Plan Orange predicted a war with the Japanese. And Fleet Problem Number 2 tested the first leg of a westward advance across the Pacific towards the Japanese. War Plan Red was for the British, black for Germany, yellow was France, green was Mexico. Different British colonies had colors that were shades of red, like ruby and crimson. Crimson was Canada. I think ruby was India. So if you're interested in learning more about these war plans, let us know in the comments section. We'll consider making videos about those in the future. It's very interesting to see, for example, War Plan Orange as it developed from around 1900 until 1940, how similar that was to the war we actually prosecuted against Japan in World War II. And how did that plan change as pre-dreadnoughts gave way to dreadnoughts, gave way to battleships and aircraft carriers. War Plan 3 saw the blue forces trying to defend the Caribbean side of the Panama Canal, while the black forces based in the Azores were trying amphibious landing techniques. Prior to World War II, the concept of landing troops in a contested beach invasion virtually never happened. And if it did happen, it didn't go well. So, for example, the Gallipoli campaign during World War I was an early attempt. So the fact that the U.S. know that they're going to have to do this to get across the Pacific, and they're starting to test the strategies and the equipment in the early 20s, is really good that they had 20 years to perfect this by the time we went into World War II. And then you see early invasions like Guadalcanal are completely thrown together. Like, stuff isn't combat loaded, so the equipment you need isn't offloaded on the beaches right away. Same thing happens in North Africa. So during Fleet Problem 3, the Black Force was able to sink the Blue Force Battleship New York in the Panama Canal and block it. And then Fleet Problem Number 4, held later that year, represented the aggressing force trying to attack the Japanese home islands, played by some Caribbean islands. Next, in 1925, March and April, you see Fleet Problem Number 5. This was a simulated attack on Hawaii. The Black Force, the aggressors, had the covered wagon, the United States' first aircraft carrier, Langley. Blue Force had no carriers and had to defend Hawaii from the carrier attacks. Experience with Langley during these peacetime exercises led to some of the design modifications that go into Lexington and Saratoga, our first fleet carriers, which are some of the ships holding the line in the early part of the Pacific War. This problem also tested refueling at sea, which would become a hallmark of United States fleet operations during World War II, which was virtually unheard of before then. Fleet Problem 6 happened in 1926 in Central America. Fleet Problem 7 was held in March of 27. It again involved the defense of the Panama Canal. Are you seeing a theme here? Again, Langley was able to successfully launch an air attack on the Panama Canal. Fleet Problem 8 brought convoy and anti-submarine tactics into it. The Orange Force, made up of primarily of U.S. Navy cruisers, was the aggressors, and Blue Force, made up of the battleships, was defending the Hawaiian Islands. but it was mostly, can we resupply the Hawaiian Islands and get a convoy through? So this was really the first time since World War I that we were testing convoy tactics. Submarine technology was advancing. Submarines were getting longer ranges. They were no longer coastal defense vessels. They could now operate in the open ocean. Fleet Problem 9 in 1929 featured Lexington and Saratoga finally joining the fleet. While the two carriers were predicted to operate together, they were split up onto different teams for this exercise, and you again saw the bulk of forces, blue battleships, protecting the Panama Canal, while the scouting forces and the aircraft carrier Saratoga played black, attacking. And the battleships were able to hold the scouting forces at bay, except the carrier Saratoga detached from the rest of the battle line with a single cruiser escorting it, was able to make an end run at high speed around the battle forts, and then launch a surprise attack at dawn on the American military installations at Panama. Meanwhile, Lexington, attached to the battle line, was sunk 3 times over the course of the engagement, and the judges kept throwing her back in so she could continue to drill and exercise. And she was able to launch successful air attacks, but it proved that carriers detached from the battle line could make bold strikes behind enemy lines, while carriers attached to the battle line were likely to be sunk. Fleet Problem number 10, held in 1930, pitted Lexington versus Langley and Saratoga. Lexington was able to get a surprise attack off and sink or disable both of her opposing carriers, and that showed just how quickly the tide of battle could turn. And this is something that proved to play out incredibly accurately during World War II, where even though your force is inferior, if you can get a strike off first, you can completely cripple the enemy carrier fleet and get the advantage. Fleet Problem 9 was held in April 1930 in the Caribbean. Fleet Problem 11. Fleet Problem 12 featured the airship Los Angeles. During the interwar period, the U.S. Navy experimented with dirigibles pretty heavily as part of their scouting forces. And this tactic proved to not play out during wartime, but luckily we learned this in peacetime instead of in combat, and so we didn't invest too many more resources after the 1930s. This attack, again, has black attacking from the west towards the Panama Canal, which is protected by blue with a number of aviation assets, and it involves the black force breaking through those air attacks and again practicing amphibious operations and setting up bases in enemy zones. Fleet Problem 13, held in March of 1932, was another really big learning experience for carriers. This one had one fleet operating out of the Hawaiian Islands, one fleet operating out of the West Coast, and they were trying to probe and find each other and engage. And each fleet had a modern fleet carrier, and each fleet had a battle line, although in one case they were real battleships, in the other case they were cruisers and imaginary battleships. But this covered a wide area of ocean with 2 fleets trying to find each other at sea, and it proved just how vital aircraft carriers were to finding each other and being able to launch the first strike. In this instance, both carriers got strikes off at roughly the same time and more or less disabled each other. And it also proved that a carrier air group could be held in reserve to defend the fleet, or it could be sent to attack the enemy fleet, but they could not do both with a single carrier. So from this point on, the United States starts looking at grouping carriers together to be able to form both a combat air patrol and an alpha strike. Fleet Problem 14 was held in February of 1933, and it again had a black force attacking blue force defending the west coast of the United States. This featured a number of simulated air attacks, and while blue force was able to deter a certain number of attacks, black was still able to get off successful attacks on simulated fleet bases on the west coast of the United States that proved the vulnerability of American bases. Fleet Problem 15 in May of 1934 was another large multi-step process that involved Hawaii and Panama and establishing forward bases and then operating out of those bases. Fleet Problem 16 in May of 35 again tested an entire campaign at sea. In this case, they had 5 distinct phases and were mostly fought in northern waters around the Aleutian Islands. Fleet Problem 17, held in the spring of 1936, the west coast of the U.S., the Panama Canal Zone, and this coast of South America, was another multi-step campaign, this time specifically testing anti-submarine operations. It was found that aircraft carrier aircraft could very easily spot surface submarines and submarines just below the surface. And so another utility for aircraft carriers, another vulnerability for submarines that was detected, which helped inform U.S. submarine operations in the Pacific during World War II. Fleet Problem 18, held the following year, in May of 37, involved the Hawaiian Islands, Midway, and the Aleutian Islands, all in the operating area. And this one was largely about invading an island and establishing a base, which, again, those amphibious operations are being refined through various fleet problems to the point that they're usable during World War II, where the United States had barely ever tested them before. We had done largely uncontested landings in the past, but the Navy was getting ready to launch contested island invasions, which was something that the war plans predicted would need to happen. Fleet Problem 19, held in the spring of 38, again involved the Hawaiian Islands, testing the defenses there, and establishing fleet bases, invading islands. It involved a lot of scouting. The aircraft carriers, this time with Ranger added to the fleet, the first purpose-built American aircraft carrier, were all involved. And it involved a lot of scouting activities, which was something that the United States Navy had traditionally been deficient in because of a lack of cruisers for that. Fleet Problem 20 involved some 134 ships, 600 planes, and over 52,000 men, and was even witnessed by President Franklin Roosevelt. This one took place in the Caribbean in the Atlantic in February of 1939, and had White Team defending the east coast of the United States and South America from an invasion by the Black Team. Fleet Problem 21 was held in 1940, and this was an 8-phase operation testing the defenses of the Hawaiian Islands. At this point, the U.S. Pacific Fleet didn't exist, but the battle force was based out of Southern California and not out of the Hawaiian Islands. But you can see that the defense of the Hawaiian Islands features very heavily in these war games. Fleet Problem 21 would be the last of the fleet problems before World War II. Fleet Problem 22, scheduled for 1941, was called off because of the fighting around the world and the reorganization of the American fleet to be positioned both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So instead of having a battle fleet and a scouting fleet, we now had an Atlantic fleet and a Pacific fleet. And different task forces there made up to do different roles. So the ships were held in reserve for possible start to hostilities instead of expending a lot of time and energy in fleet problems, which then required a lot of maintenance afterwards, simultaneously for a lot of ships. The fleet problems really informed the way the United States fought World War II. And I can't imagine how much more of a learning curve there would have been, how many more ships we would have lost, how many more men we would have lost, how much longer the war would have been if we had to learn all this in actual combat. The techniques that you see, amphibious operations, setting up forward bases and invading islands, submarine warfare and anti-submarine warfare, and most importantly, carrier warfare, which simply had not existed prior to these fleet exercises, gave the United States the experience it needed to start World War II. The Japanese trained very heavily, and Japanese enlistments were longer than American enlistments. So your average Japanese sailor in 1941 was more experienced than your average American sailor. The Japanese did a tremendous amount of training to prepare their carrier aviation, and they saw combat over China in the years leading up to the Pacific War becoming World War II. So if the United States had not conducted these problems, perfected their equipment and strategies, and trained their sailors and officer corps with these exercises, we would have been at even more of a disadvantage than we were when we entered the Pacific War. And we were at a disadvantage. Japanese carrier equipment and tactics were far superior to the United States, but not superior enough to destroy our carriers and leave us defenseless. We had just enough experience, just enough new equipment and understanding of how to use it to be able to hold the line for our industrial complex to swing into high gear and give us what we needed to completely win through numbers. The fleet problems didn't happen from 1940 on. Various other training exercises replaced them, typically regionally. There would be NATO training exercises in the Atlantic, and there would be rim pack training exercises in the Pacific, where us and allied fleets would operate together. In 2016, the U.S. Navy held Fleet Problem 23. This takes its number straight from 22, which was supposed to be held in 1941 and wasn't. So they just started the numbering there. They called it the same thing. It's so recent, I'm not entirely sure what transpired in that action. It did involve the aircraft carrier Carl Vinson, and I do believe that future fleet problems are planned in that same vein, but I can't comment on how modern fleet problems compare to the pre-war ones. Thank you guys for watching. If you've done any training exercises on Navy ships operating with fleets, RIMPAC or NATO, or maybe even this Fleet Problem 23, let us know about it in the comment section down below. If you're interested in seeing videos about the U.S. Navy's interwar war plans in the same vein as this video, also let us know down there. If we get enough interest, we might research those videos and produce some content in the next year. We put out new content several times a week, so remember to like, share, and subscribe so you're notified when new stuff is coming out. And we do receive operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, but also from viewers like you. And if you like the content we create and would like to support our YouTube channel, check the link in the description below for our GoFundMe campaign for ways you can donate to support us. Thanks for watching.